The day my neighbor made me take down my awning, I remember thinking, this is one of those small things that shouldn't matter, but somehow will. And I wasn't wrong, just not in the way I expected. Because a few months later, the sun didn't just come back. It stayed, it settled in, and it started quietly tearing something apart right next door. My name's Daniel Mercer. I've lived in the same narrow slice of a neighborhood just outside Sacramento for almost 12 years now. And if you've ever seen those older residential blocks where the houses feel like they were built just a little too close together, like whoever planned it underestimated how much people value space, that's where I am. My place sits on a long, tight lot, the kind where your side yard isn't really a yard, more like a corridor of light and heat, especially in the afternoons when the sun drops low and starts hitting everything sideways. And that sun, it's not gentle. Around here, by late spring, it comes in sharp and heavy, like it's got something to prove. It hits the west-facing wall straight on, and because of how close the houses are, it just bounces between surfaces, building heat in a way you don't really notice until you step outside, and it feels like opening an oven. Years ago, maybe 4 or 5 after I moved in, I put up a small awning over my back patio. Nothing fancy, no stripes, no decorative nonsense, just a simple, neutral-colored extension that gave me a strip of shade wide enough to sit under with a chair and a glass of something cold after work. I didn't even think much about it beyond that. It made the space usable, kept the worst of the sunlight off my sliding doors, and, as it turned out, it cast a bit of shade onto the neighboring wall too. That wall belonged to the house next door, a place that changed hands a couple of times before settling into what I thought would be a long-term situation. The siding on that house was this pale, almost off-white paneling, the kind that looks clean when it's new but tends to show every bit of wear if it's exposed too long. My awning, by pure coincidence more than intention, blocked the harshest angle of the afternoon sun from hitting a section of it. Not completely, just enough to soften things. And for years that was it. No complaints, no conversations about it, no issues. It was just part of the environment, like a tree that casts shade over a fence line. Nobody questions it because it's just there. Then came Kyle. Kyle Brennan bought the place next door in early spring, and I remember the first time I saw him because he didn't move in like most people do. No gradual settling, no boxes stacked on the porch for days. He showed up with a crew, a plan, and a very specific idea of what his house should look like. Within the first 2 weeks, the place was power washed, repainted, trimmed, and stripped of anything that didn't fit this clean, sharp, almost sterile aesthetic he seemed to be going for. I met him properly about a week after he moved in. I was out back, sitting under that same awning, when he leaned over the fence just enough to introduce himself. He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, more like a polite formality. "Hey," he said, glancing up almost immediately. "That structure yours?" I followed his gaze. "The awning?" "Yeah, put it in a few years back." He nodded slowly, like he was filing something away. "It comes pretty close to the property line." I shrugged. "It's within it. Had it measured and permitted when I installed it." "Right," he said, still looking at it. Not at me. "Just seems intrusive." That was the word he chose. Intrusive. I remember letting out a small laugh, not because it was funny, but because it felt like such an odd way to describe something that had been there, quietly minding its own business, for years. "It's been up a long time," I told him. "Never been an issue." He finally looked at me then, and there was something in his expression, not anger, not yet, but a kind of fixed dissatisfaction, like he'd already decided it didn't belong. "Well," he said, "it is now." That was the first moment I realized this wasn't going to be a casual neighbor relationship. A few days later, I got a notice. Not a conversation, not a knock on the door, a formal complaint. He'd filed it with the city, claiming the awning extended too close to the boundary line and negatively affected the visual appeal of his property. Visual appeal, that one stuck with me. So I did what anyone would do. I went back through everything. Permits, measurements, the original contractor's documentation, all of it checked out. The structure was fully compliant, set back exactly where it needed to be, no overreach, no violations. On paper, there was no issue. I figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't, because Kyle didn't stop at one complaint. He followed up, pushed it further, requested inspections, sent additional filings. Each one worded just differently enough to keep the process moving. It wasn't about whether he was right anymore. It was about persistence. And the thing about systems like that, if someone keeps knocking, eventually, the door opens, even if just a crack. We had a couple more interactions during that time, none of them pleasant. One afternoon, I caught him outside while I was bringing in groceries, and I decided to address it directly. You know it's within code, I said, trying to keep things level. You've seen the measurements. He crossed his arms, leaning back slightly like he was settling into a position. Code doesn't account for everything, he replied. Like what? Like how it affects the space next to it. My space. I shook my head. It's been there longer than you have. And now I'm here, he said. Simple as that. There it was. Not about legality, not really about boundaries, it's about control. About what he thought his environment should be, and anything that didn't fit that vision, even if it wasn't his to change, became a problem. The back and forth dragged on longer than I expected. Weeks turned into a couple of months, letters, emails, a pending hearing that neither of us really wanted to sit through. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I found myself doing the math, time, energy, stress. And the truth was, I was tired. Not defeated, not wrong. Just tired of something small turning into something that kept demanding more attention than it deserved. So one afternoon, after staring at that awning for longer than I'd like to admit, I made a decision that didn't feel good, but felt final. I called a guy, scheduled the removal, and a few days later, just like that, the structure that had quietly done its job for years was gone in the span of a single afternoon. Kyle didn't come over, didn't say anything, but I saw him watching from his window while it happened. And I remember thinking, as the last piece came down and the sunlight poured in unobstructed for the first time in years, some things don't cause problems until they're gone. The first few days after the awning came down, honestly, nothing felt dramatic, no immediate shift, no moment where I stepped outside and thought, well, here it is. This is the consequence. It was quieter than that. Almost underwhelming. Like the world just absorbed the change without reacting. And if you weren't paying attention, you could have convinced yourself nothing really mattered either way. But the light was different, and I noticed that right away. Not in a way that slapped you in the face. More like something you feel before you fully see it. The way the air gets just a little heavier before a hot day settles in. The patio, which used to hold on to shade well into the late afternoon, now sat wide open, exposed, and by around 3:30 or 4, the sun would start creeping across the concrete, stretching longer and sharper until there was nowhere left to sit without squinting. Inside the house, the temperature ticked up too, just a couple degrees at first, enough that I found myself adjusting the thermostat more often, noticing how the light hit the floor differently, how the glare off the glass doors lingered longer than it used to. None of it was catastrophic, just persistent, like something small repeating itself over and over until you couldn't ignore it anymore. And next door, well, that's where things started to get interesting, though not all at once. Kyle's place looked exactly the same in those early weeks. Clean lines, fresh paint, everything sharp and intentional, the kind of house you'd expect to see in a listing photo with words like modern and minimal underneath it. If anything, he seemed pleased. I caught glimpses of him out back a few times, standing with his hands on his hips, scanning the space like he was finally seeing it the way he'd wanted from the start. We didn't talk. Not right away. There was this unspoken gap between us, like we'd both agreed, without saying it, that the situation was resolved, even if it hadn't exactly been settled. Then summer showed up. And if you've never experienced a Sacramento summer pressed up against reflective surfaces and tight spacing, it's hard to explain just how direct that heat can feel. It doesn't just fall from above. It comes at you from angles, off walls, through narrow gaps, amplified by anything light-colored or smooth enough to bounce it right back. And Kyle's siding, that pale, almost white paneling that looked so crisp when he moved in, it started catching every bit of that sunlight. By mid-June, the pattern became obvious. Around 2 in the afternoon, the sun would begin its descent into that perfect angle where it lined up with our shared side, and from that point on, it didn't let up for hours. There was no awning anymore to soften it, no partial shade to break it apart, just a straight, uninterrupted path of light hitting that wall day after day. At first, the changes were subtle, the kind you question when you notice them, like maybe it's always been like that, and you just never paid attention. I'd be out back watering the plants or just standing there for a minute, and I'd catch a slight ripple along one of the siding panels, not enough to call it damage, just not perfectly flat anymore. Then a week later, it would be a little more noticeable, a faint waviness that caught the light differently, depending on the time of day. The thing about materials like that, especially in heat like ours, is they expand just a little during the hottest part of the day, then contract again when things cool off at night, and if that cycle repeats enough times, especially without any relief from direct exposure, those small shifts start to add up. It's not immediate, not dramatic, but it's relentless. By early July, the discoloration started showing up. Nothing extreme, just a slight yellowing in the sections that took the brunt of the sun, almost like the surface was being slowly bleached and aged at the same time. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. I remember standing there one evening, leaning against the fence, looking at that wall and thinking, this is exactly what that awning used to prevent. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to make a difference over time. And that's when the first real interaction happened after everything had been taken down. Kyle came out while I was out there, not in his usual composed way, but with a kind of distracted energy, like something had been bothering him for a while, and he'd finally decided to say something about it. He didn't start with a greeting. He just looked at the wall, then back at me. "Hey," he said, "has it always been this hot back here?" I let that sit for a second, not because I didn't understand the question, but because I knew exactly where it was coming from. "In the summer?" I replied, "Yeah, pretty much." He frowned slightly, stepping closer to his side of the fence, glancing along the siding like he was inspecting it for the first time. "I don't remember it hitting this hard," he said. I nodded toward the space above my patio, now empty. "The awning used to block a lot of it," I said. "Not all, but enough." There was a pause then, the kind where you can almost hear someone recalculating something in their head. "So that has shaded this wall too?" he asked. "Part of it," I said, "especially during peak hours." He didn't respond right away. He just kept looking at it, eyes tracing the faint distortions, the uneven lines where everything used to be uniform. And for a moment, I thought he might say something like, "Maybe we should have handled that differently," or "Maybe I didn't realize." But instead, he just exhaled and said, "Huh." That was it. But after that, things shifted. Not in a big, confrontational way, more like a quiet tension settling in, the kind that comes from realizing something can't be easily undone. Over the next few weeks, the changes became harder to ignore. The warping along the panels grew more pronounced, especially in the sections that faced directly into that afternoon sun. Edges that used to line up cleanly started to misalign just enough to catch shadows, creating this subtle but noticeable pattern across the wall. It wasn't catastrophic damage, nothing falling apart, but it was visible, and once it reached that point, it started affecting the overall look of the house. And Kyle noticed. I'd see him out there more often now, sometimes running his hand along the siding, sometimes just standing back and staring at it, like he was trying to will it back into place. There were a couple of times he had someone over, maybe a contractor or inspector, pointing at the same spots I'd been watching for weeks. Conversations I couldn't hear, but could easily guess. One afternoon, he finally came over, actually knocked this time. I opened the door, and he stood there with a different expression than I'd seen before, less certain, maybe even a little frustrated, but not at me specifically, more at the situation. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." He hesitated, like he didn't love what he was about to say. "That awning, how much of a difference did it really make?" I leaned against the doorframe, thinking about how to answer that without turning it into something bigger than it needed to be. "Over time," I said, "a lot. It broke up the direct exposure, kept things from heating up as fast, and from staying hot as long." He nodded slowly. "And now?" I gestured toward the side yard. "Now it just takes the full hit." There was that silence again, heavier this time. "I've got someone telling me this might need partial replacement," he said, almost to himself. "Panels, maybe more if it keeps spreading." I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have thoughts, but because none of them felt necessary to say out loud. This wasn't a moment for being right. It was just a moment where cause and effect were lining up in real time. He looked at me then, finally meeting my eyes. "You ever think about putting it back up?" That question hung there longer than I expected. And I'll tell you exactly what went through my head in that moment. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a quiet recognition of how strange the whole thing had become. "Not really," I said. "You had concerns about it." He gave a small, almost humorless laugh. "Yeah," he said, "I did. We stood there for a second, both aware of what wasn't being said. And that's when I realized this wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about understanding something a little too late. He stood there for another second like he might say something else, maybe ask directly, maybe admit something, but instead he just nodded once, short and tight, and stepped back off the porch. "All right," he said, almost under his breath. "Just thought I'd ask." And that was it. No apology, no real acknowledgement. Just a man walking back to a problem he couldn't unsee anymore. After that conversation, things didn't go back to normal. Not that they ever really were normal to begin with, but whatever quiet distance had settled between us before, it shifted into something heavier, more defined. Not hostile, not outwardly tense, just aware. Like we were both walking around the same truth, just choosing not to step directly on it. The heat didn't let up. If anything, July rolled into August like it had something to prove, stacking day after day of dry, relentless sunlight, the kind that makes surfaces feel like they're storing energy instead of just reflecting it. My patio stayed exposed. Of course, by then I'd gotten used to it, adjusted my routine, moved my chair further inside, accepted that the space I used to enjoy in the afternoons had a different rhythm now. It was inconvenient, but manageable. Next door wasn't as forgiving. The siding continued to shift, slowly but consistently. What started as slight warping had turned into something you could spot from across the yard without even trying. The lines weren't straight anymore. Certain panels bowed outward just enough to break the uniform look Kyle had worked so hard to create. The discoloration deepened too, uneven patches spreading along the areas that took the worst of the sun, like a quiet map of exposure drawn over time. And the thing is, once something like that crosses a certain threshold, it stops being something you can ignore and starts becoming something you have to explain. I heard more activity over there. Different contractors, different voices, the occasional sound of tools, though nothing ever seemed to fully fix the issue. One afternoon, I caught part of a conversation drifting over the fence, just fragments carried by the heat. Thermal stress. No shade on this side. Replacing sections might help, but lingered longer than the rest. A few days later, Kyle came by again. This time, he didn't knock right away. I saw him through the window, standing on the edge of the walkway like he was debating whether or not to even have the conversation. Eventually, he did. I opened the door, and for the first time since he moved in, he looked different. Not defeated exactly, but worn down in a way that had nothing to do with appearances. "Hey," he said, quieter than usual. "Hey." He glanced back toward his house, then back at me. "They're saying the heat's the main issue," he said. "That side just takes it straight on now." I nodded. "Yeah." Another pause, but this one didn't feel tense. It felt honest. "I didn't think it mattered that much," he admitted, finally. "The awning. I thought it was just extra." I leaned against the frame again, not in a defensive way, just steady. "A lot of things look like that," I said, "until they're not there anymore." He let out a small breath, something between a sigh and a quiet laugh. "Yeah," he said, "guess I'm seeing that now." For a second, it almost felt like we were just two neighbors talking about weather, about materials, about the kind of things homeowners deal with all the time. But underneath it, there was something else, something unspoken but clear. Cause, effect, timing. "So what are you going to do?" I asked. He shook his head slightly. "They're talking about replacing panels, maybe upgrading to something more heat-resistant," he said. "It's not cheap. I can imagine." He hesitated again, and I could see the thought forming before he even said it. "If you ever, decided to put something back up," he started, careful with his words. "I wouldn't," he trailed off, then tried again. "I don't think I'd have a problem with it." There it was. Not quite an apology, not quite a request, but close enough that you could feel what he meant. And I'll be honest with you, there was a moment, just a brief one, where I considered it. Not because I wanted to fix his problem, and not because I felt any obligation to, but because part of me remembered what that shade felt like, how simple it had been, how effective without drawing attention to itself. But then another thought settled in right behind it, quieter, steadier. "It's fine," I said. "I've gotten used to it this way." He nodded slowly, like he expected that answer, or maybe like he understood it. "Yeah," he said, "fair enough." We didn't say much after that. He headed back, I closed the door, and that was the last real conversation we had about it. Time moved on, like it always does. The heat eventually broke, fall rolled in, the lights softened, and for a while, everything just paused. The damage didn't reverse, of course, but it stopped getting worse, settling into its final shape, a quiet reminder running along the side of his house. From my patio, I can still see it. The difference between the section that used to sit under the edge of that awning and the parts that didn't, it's subtle if you're not looking for it. But once you know, once you've seen the timeline of it all, it stands out in a way that doesn't need explaining. And that's the part that stuck with me more than anything. Not the argument, not the complaints, not even the outcome itself, but how something so small, so easy to dismiss, could carry a function you don't fully understand until it's gone. Carl still lives there. We're polite when we cross paths, the kind of nod you give someone when there's history but no ongoing fight. He made his changes, I made mine, and the sun just kept doing what it always does, following the same path, day after day, completely indifferent to what we thought should or shouldn't be in its way. Sometimes I sit out there in the late afternoon, even now, when it's cooler, and I look at that empty space above my patio where the awning used to be, and I think about how easily things shift. How quickly a decision made to keep the peace can reveal something you didn't realize was holding things together in the first place. And here's the thing, I never put it back up. Not out of spite, not to prove a point. Just because once something is gone, sometimes it stays gone, and what's left behind becomes part of the story whether you like it or not. But I'll say this, every time the light hits that wall just right, every time those slight distortions catch the shadow and make themselves known, it tells the whole story without a single word being spoken. Some people call that karma. Some call it consequence. Me, I just call it sunlight. And now I'm curious what you think. Was I wrong for taking it down in the first place? Or should I have stood my ground and forced the issue? And if you were in Kyle's position, would you have handled it differently once you realized what that intrusive little awning was actually doing? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, this feels like one of those situations where everyone's got a point, until the outcome shows up and decides for you.